My name's Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years.
Ethiopian Women, podcast number 23. Ethiopia is a beautiful country. The mountains and great weather conditions in the higher elevations will sometimes be breathtaking. However, the southern desert-like areas are hot and more stressful in which to live. Each area has its beauty and distinction. Many times you can tell from which tribes the people are from by their hairstyles, dress, and even the color of their skin. Some are light-skinned with fine features, and others are darker. It was amazing that they would refer to themselves by color, light, dark, or darker, and sometimes even red. The Ethiopians are beautiful people. Their features are fine, and many could be models. In the large cities, their dress is very Western, although they do wear the Ethiopian national dress on holidays. The designs and patterns would be the envy of designers everywhere. 80% of the people live in rural areas, so they don't have much interaction with the outside world. The women are forced to work in the fields along with childbearing and keeping up the household duties. They walk miles to get water. I can see them in my mind walking, all bent over with water jugs on their head, or carrying large bundles of sticks tied to their backs, going to the market to sell whatever they could. Life is indeed difficult for them. Many of them are promised in marriage while they're still very young and give birth before they are physically ready. This obviously creates physical problems for them. The mortality rate of these women and their babies is very high. Because of their young age, they are not prepared for childbirth, and this permanently damages their bodies and leaves them incontinent. Consequently, they are ostracized by their families and forced to live alone, either in a separate room or often in a small hut outside the home. Those that are able will often walk for miles trying to find help and will often come to Addis Ababa, where they eventually find the Fistula Hospital, which was founded by Drs. Reg and Catherine Hamlin, who came from Australia to help women with this condition. The Hamlins answered an advertisement in the British medical journal, The Lancet, which read, "Gynecologists wanted to set up a school of midwifery for nurses in the Princess Sahai Memorial Hospital in Addis Ababa." So, since they wanted to serve in a country where their skills were needed, they answered the advertisement. In 1959, they left Australia for Ethiopia on a short-term stint in order to establish a midwifery school. The need was far greater than they had even imagined. Their contract was for 3 years, but that short term turned into over 60 years of service in Ethiopia. Even after her husband passed in 1993, Dr. Catherine, as she was known, remained in Ethiopia until her death in 2020 at the age of 96. The Hamlins had trained many doctors and nurses, and the Fistula Hospital is still going strong. The Hamlins dedicated their lives to surgically helping those women who had given birth at a very young age. It is called fistula because of a tear in either the urinary tract or the intestines, and often in both. This problem could have been easily treated had there been medical facilities or skilled doctors available. Before the Hamlins came to Ethiopia, Fistula sufferers were rejected by their own families and society as a whole. They were unable to bear children and were treated like lepers. Many stories were told of women coming to Addis, crying for help, but I would like to share some of these from Dr. Catherine herself. I quote, "As word of our success spread, we began to see more and more women suffering from fistulas. What a tragic sight they were, offensive to smell, dressed in rags, often completely destitute. They would sometimes walk for 200 or 300 kilometers to get to Addis Ababa. One girl turned up with her mother after walking for 15 days. They had no money and nowhere to stay, so we paid for the girl's admission ourselves and allowed her mother to sleep on the floor beside her bed. Another young woman arrived after walking 450 kilometers. She too was in rags and had no money. She was a difficult case with 2 big holes in her bladder, through which part of the bladder had prolapsed, making it painful for her to sit down. She had endured this for 10 years. After her surgery, it was an amazing transformation. Before, she had been downcast and miserable. Now she was reborn as a beautiful, smiling woman with a look of joy in her eyes. We bought her a new dress to go home in, and she kept holding it up for everyone to see. When it was time for her to leave, we took her to the bus station and gave her bus fare. She tried to kiss our feet and said, "God will reward you for all you have done for me." End of quote. The Hamlins continued their work, but in 1968 they realized they needed a separate hospital for fistula patients. However, there were many obstacles in constructing a new hospital: finances, obtaining property, and getting government permission. Each of these were huge obstacles. They made the decision to return to Australia and New Zealand to raise the funds needed. The need was met, but it was another matter in obtaining government permission to build. Emperor Haile Selassie gave permission concerning the property, but there was much red tape that went with that. The Ministry of Health gave verbal permission, but later retracted it. It was only after Dr. Reg threatened to leave and move to Kenya that they obtained the permission necessary to proceed. From the time they received permission to buy the land and build the building, 4 years had passed. Even with all the difficulties, their hearts were full of joy at how God had worked. The building was finally completed in 1975. In 1993, at the age of 85, Dr. Reginald Hamlin died. We had the privilege of having Dr. Catherine and a fellow missionary in our home for tea. She was such a pleasant and humble lady. It was so evident that her heart and soul was in the work she was doing. Ethiopia was certainly her home. Sometime later, she came to the States and was on the Oprah Winfrey program, where she was given the entire time to talk about her work in Ethiopia at the Fistula Hospital. She was adamant that she wanted nothing for herself, but the need of the women was her main priority. She died in 2020 at her home in Ethiopia. Everyone in the country could feel the void she left. The hospital was renamed Hamlin Fistula Hospital. The work continues, but Ethiopia will never forget Dr. Reg and Dr. Catherine Hamlin, who built the only hospital of its kind in the world, dedicated exclusively to women with obstetric fistula and training obstetricians to specialize in this surgery. The Hamlins were a great blessing to the women of Ethiopia, and physical healing often gives the opportunity for spiritual healing. As I think of those poor women who found a new lease on life, I'm reminded of our own spiritual condition. We were destitute and dressed in the rags of our sins, but God performed spiritual surgery on us and dressed us in His righteousness. We experience joy and peace for the first time in our lives. That is the ultimate hope of Ethiopia and of the world. Our hope is in Him who gave His life for us. Jean and I have devoted our lives to bringing the gospel to the people of Ethiopia, and if we had another lifetime, we would do it all over again. Will you pray that God will send more workers to that needy field? Thank you for listening to podcast number 23. We look forward to bringing more stories about the work in Ethiopia.